The Florida Bloodbath, the televangelist who slaughtered 11 men over a stolen cross. The humidity hung thick over Tampa Bay like a wet blanket, the kind that made your shirt stick to your back the moment you stepped outside. Pastor Marcus Webb stood at the pulpit of the Redemption Grace megachurch, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system as 2,000 faithful followers hung on his every word. The lights caught the silver threads in his perfectly styled hair, and his custom-tailored suit probably cost more than most of his congregation made in a month. Sweat glistened on the foreheads of the people packed into the pews, but nobody seemed to mind the heat. They were transfixed by the man before them, hanging on every syllable as if their eternal souls depended on it. "Brothers and sisters," Marcus proclaimed, his arms spread wide like he was trying to embrace the entire congregation, "the Lord has blessed this ministry beyond measure. Your faith, your donations, they've built something magnificent here in the heart of Florida." The crowd erupted in applause and amens, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling like thunder. Marcus smiled, but his eyes remained cold, calculating, scanning the crowd, not with love, but with the practiced assessment of a predator evaluating prey. Behind that charismatic facade lurked something darker, something that had been festering for years beneath the surface of his carefully constructed image. Marcus Webb had learned early in life that people wanted to be told what to believe. They craved certainty, needed someone to promise them that everything would be okay if they just had enough faith and wrote enough checks. He'd built an empire on that fundamental human weakness, and he'd gotten very rich doing it. The megachurch complex sprawled across 15 acres of prime real estate, complete with a broadcasting studio that rivaled any network facility, a Christian bookstore that did millions in annual sales, and a cafe that served overpriced lattes to the faithful before and after services. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Now let's continue. The church had grown from a small storefront operation 15 years ago to this massive complex. Marcus Webb had become a household name in evangelical circles, his Sunday sermons reaching millions through his television program, The Path to Redemption, that aired on cable networks across the country. But success had come with a price, and Marcus had made compromises along the way that would have shocked his devoted followers. He'd started with small lies, exaggerating the size of his first congregation, embellishing stories about his supposed missionary work in Africa that had never actually happened, claiming divine visions that were really just clever marketing strategies. The lies had snowballed, each one requiring another to cover it up, until his entire life had become a performance with no authentic core remaining. In his private office behind the main sanctuary, accessed through a hallway that required 3 separate key codes to navigate, Marcus kept his most prized possession, a supposedly ancient cross that he claimed had been blessed by missionaries in Jerusalem during the Crusades. He'd spent a fortune acquiring it from a private collector, or so he told everyone, and it had become the centerpiece of his ministry's origin story. According to the carefully crafted narrative Marcus had repeated so many times, he almost believed it himself. He'd been given a divine vision to find this cross during a particularly dark period of his life. He'd followed that vision across 3 continents, finally locating it in the hands of a dying monk who'd recognized Marcus's holy purpose and entrusted him with the sacred relic. The cross had led him to Tampa, where he'd been instructed to build a church that would reach millions. The story was compelling, profitable, and completely fabricated from beginning to end. The truth was far more mundane and infinitely more pathetic. Marcus had bought the cross at an estate sale in Orlando for $300. It wasn't ancient, wasn't blessed by anyone more significant than the factory worker who'd assembled it in Taiwan, and had never been anywhere near Jerusalem or any other holy site. It was a mass-produced piece of decorative religious kitsch, the kind you could find in any Christian bookstore's clearance section. But his congregation didn't need to know that. They needed faith, and Marcus had learned long ago that faith was easier to manufacture than earn. The cross became his Excalibur, his holy grail, the physical manifestation of God's favor on his ministry. People came from all over the country just to see it, to pray before it, to touch the glass case that housed it and hope for miracles. Marcus had even hired a marketing firm to create a whole mythology around the cross. They'd produced a documentary-style video about his supposed quest to find it, complete with dramatic reenactments and interviews with experts who authenticated its significance. The video sold thousands of copies, became a staple of Christian television programming, and generated more donations than Marcus had ever dreamed possible. He'd used those donations to expand the church, to buy the television time slots, to fund his increasingly lavish lifestyle. The Bentley in his private garage, the beachfront mansion in Clearwater, the vacation home in the Smoky Mountains, all of it built on the foundation of a $300 fake. That Tuesday morning in late August, everything changed. Marcus arrived at the church at 6 a.m., as he always did, to prepare for the day's television taping. The Florida sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the parking lot was empty except for his car and the vehicles belonging to the overnight security staff. He used his private entrance on the east side of the building, bypassed the security cameras he'd intentionally placed at misleading angles years ago, specifically so he'd have blind spots for his own comings and goings, and made his way through the maze of hallways to his office. He'd been thinking about his sermon for Sunday, planning another emotional appeal for the building fund that would finance the new youth center. The architecture firm had presented the designs yesterday, and Marcus had already calculated how much he could skim off the top without anyone noticing. The moment he opened his office door, his blood ran cold. The display case was empty. The cross was gone. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were telling him. The case sat on its pedestal, exactly where it always had, the spotlight still illuminating the empty space where the cross should have been. The lock on the case showed no signs of damage. Whoever had taken it had either picked the lock with considerable skill or had a key. Marcus's hands trembled as he approached the case, as if getting closer might somehow make the cross reappear. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him, followed by a cold panic that started in his chest and radiated outward until his fingers tingled. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not after everything he'd built. Marcus stood frozen, his mind racing through possibilities and implications. Only 3 people had keys to his office: himself, his assistant Sarah Chen, and the head of security Dwight Morrison. The security system showed no signs of forced entry when he checked the control panel on the wall. This was an inside job, had to be. Someone he trusted, someone he'd given access to, had betrayed him. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus, though he was too panicked to appreciate it. His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone. Not to call the police. That would invite too many questions, too much scrutiny into the cross's authenticity and the financial records he'd carefully kept hidden in a dozen different accounts. Forensic accountants would have a field day with his books, and the IRS would probably throw him in prison long before any theft charges got sorted out. No, Marcus had other resources, connections he'd made over the years that existed in the shadows of his public ministry, people who owed him favors, who operated outside the law, who could handle problems discreetly. Within an hour, Sarah and Dwight were in his office, both looking confused and alarmed by the emergency summons. Sarah had been in the middle of her morning yoga routine when Marcus called, and she'd thrown on jeans and a t-shirt instead of her usual professional attire. Dwight had been home having breakfast with his wife, and he still had a smudge of jam on his collar. Marcus studied their faces carefully, searching for any sign of guilt, any flicker of knowledge or nervousness that would tell him who was responsible. Sarah Chen, barely 30 years old with a master's degree in communications from Florida State, had been with him for 5 years, handling his schedule and correspondence with quiet efficiency. She was the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants, spoke 3 languages fluently, and had turned down better-paying jobs at Fortune 500 companies because she believed in the mission of redemption grace. She organized his life with military precision, anticipated his needs before he voiced them, and had never once questioned his decisions or asked uncomfortable questions. Marcus had always appreciated her discretion and loyalty, valued her enough to pay her well above market rate for her position. Dwight Morrison, a former cop in his 50s with a military bearing and a distinguished service record, had run security for 3 years after retiring from the Tampa Police Department. He'd served 25 years on the force, earned multiple commendations, and had a reputation for being honest to a fault. That honesty had eventually cost him promotions, He'd reported corruption in his own department, testified against fellow officers, refused to look the other way when powerful people broke the law. Marcus had hired him specifically because that reputation gave the church credibility, made their security seem ironclad and trustworthy. Dwight took his job seriously, ran constant drills with his team, updated the security systems regularly, and treated protecting the church like it was a military installation. "Someone stole the cross," Marcus said simply, watching their reactions with the intensity of a poker player reading tells. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening with genuine shock. "Oh my God, Pastor Webb, how? When?" Her voice cracked slightly, and Marcus saw tears forming in her eyes. Either she was innocent, or she was an exceptional actress. Dwight's expression hardened immediately, his cop instincts kicking in. He moved toward the display case, careful not to touch anything, examining it from different angles. "I'll review the security footage. When did you last see it?" "Yesterday afternoon," Marcus lied smoothly. He'd actually checked it obsessively every few hours, a nervous habit he'd developed over the years. Sometimes he'd come to the office in the middle of the night, just to look at it, to remind himself of what he'd built and what he had to protect. "I want it back, whatever it takes." Something in his tone made them both shift uncomfortably. There was an edge to his voice, a barely contained fury that didn't match his usual carefully modulated pastoral demeanor. Sarah glanced at Dwight, and some unspoken communication passed between them. Dwight cleared his throat. "We should call the police, file a report. The sooner we get law enforcement involved—" "No police!" Marcus cut him off sharply, more forcefully than he'd intended. He saw both of them react to his vehemence, saw the questions forming behind their eyes. He forced himself to soften his tone, to slip back into his pastoral persona. "This is a matter for the church to handle internally. That cross is sacred to this ministry, to our entire mission. I won't have it dragged through some evidence room photographed and catalogued like common stolen property. We handle this ourselves quietly, and we get it back." Sarah and Dwight exchanged another glance, longer this time. They'd both learned over the years that when Pastor Webb made a decision, it was final. He didn't take suggestions well, didn't like being questioned or contradicted. His authority in the church was absolute, and he'd fired people for less than persistent disagreement. Still, Dwight looked troubled, his cop instincts clearly warring with his employment obligations. "Pastor," Dwight said carefully, "I understand your concern about the cross's significance, but theft is a serious crime. We're talking about breaking and entering, possibly conspiracy if multiple people were involved. The police have resources we don't, forensic capabilities." "I said no police," Marcus repeated, and this time the threat in his voice was unmistakable. "Am I making myself unclear, Dwight? Because if you're uncomfortable following my instructions, I'm sure I can find someone who isn't." The room went silent. Sarah stared at the floor, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Dwight's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. "Understood. I'll pull the footage. See what I can find." "Do that," Marcus said, dismissing them both with a wave. "And keep this between us for now. I don't want word getting out until we know more." After they left, Marcus sank into his leather desk chair and put his head in his hands. This was a disaster. If the cross's theft became public knowledge, the media would investigate. They'd want to know everything about it, where it came from, how Marcus had acquired it, whether it was authentic. The whole house of cards would collapse, and Marcus would be exposed as the fraud he'd always been. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built would be destroyed. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't let that happen. Over the next week, Marcus became consumed with finding the cross. Sleep eluded him, and when he did manage to drift off, he had nightmares about standing before his congregation while reporters shouted questions about the fake cross, while board members demanded explanations, while everything he'd built crumbled around him. He lost weight, his eyes developed dark circles, and people started asking if he was feeling well. He blamed it on a stomach bug, on the stress of planning the new youth center, on anything except the truth. He hired a private investigator, a man named Vincent Caruso, who operated in the gray areas of legality. Vincent came recommended by a member of Marcus's congregation who owned several nightclubs and had occasional need for discreet services. Vincent was expensive, discreet, and had a reputation for getting results by any means necessary. He was in his 40s, balding, with the kind of forgettable face that made him perfect for surveillance work. He'd been a cop once, like Dwight, but Vincent had gone in a different direction after leaving the force. He asked questions that cops weren't allowed to ask, went places they couldn't go, did things that would never hold up in court. Marcus met with Vincent in a parking garage in downtown Tampa, far from the church and away from any of his usual haunts. He paid cash for the initial consultation, explained the situation without admitting the cross was fake, and gave Vincent everything he had. Descriptions, security footage that showed nothing useful, a list of people who had access to his office. Vincent took the job without asking the questions Marcus had been dreading. "I'll start with your staff," he said, pocketing the thick envelope of cash. "Inside jobs are usually personal. Someone wants money or revenge, or maybe they're just greedy. I'll find out which and track the cross from there." But even with Vincent's resources, leads were scarce. The security footage revealed nothing. The blind spots Marcus had deliberately created worked too well, and whoever had taken the cross had known exactly where the cameras weren't looking. Sarah and Dwight both had alibis for the night in question, and neither showed any signs of suspicious spending or behavior. Vincent interviewed the other security guards, the cleaning staff, anyone who'd been in the building that night. Nothing. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening, 11 days after the theft. Vincent called Marcus with news, and the excitement in his voice made Marcus's heart race. "I tracked it to a pawn shop in Clearwater," Vincent said. "Guy named Eddie Simmons runs the place, deals mostly in electronics and jewelry, but he's got a side business in religious artifacts. One of my sources says he sold a cross matching your description 4 days ago." "Who bought it?" Marcus demanded, already reaching for his car keys. "That's where it gets complicated," Vincent said carefully, and Marcus heard the warning in his tone. "Buyer's name is Thomas Ridley, small-time fence who specializes in religious artifacts and antiques. He's got connections throughout Florida, moves merchandise for collectors who don't ask questions about provenance. Word is he's been showing the cross around, bragging about making a major score." "Where is he?" Marcus demanded. "That's the complication I mentioned. Ridley's connected. He works with some serious people, has protection from some heavy hitters in the local underground economy. Going after him directly could get messy. We're talking about people who don't respond well to pressure, who have resources and aren't afraid to use violence." "I don't care about messy," Marcus said, his voice dropping to something that didn't sound like a pastor at all. It was the voice of someone who'd spent years pretending to be good while doing whatever was necessary to get ahead. Someone who'd learned that morality was just another performance for people with enough money and power. "I want my property back. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, just find him." Vincent was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could almost hear him recalculating, reassessing what kind of person he was really working for. "There's something else," Vincent finally said. "Ridley's been bragging about this score. Says he's sitting on something big, something that could expose a major televangelist as a fraud. He's shopping around to media outlets, seeing who'll pay the most for the story and the proof to back it up." Marcus felt the walls closing in. The panic he'd been managing through sheer force of will threatened to overwhelm him. If Ridley went public with proof that the cross was a fake, everything would unravel. His ministry, his fortune, his carefully constructed life, all of it would collapse. The IRS would investigate his finances, his board would demand answers he couldn't give, his congregation would abandon him. He'd lose everything, end up in prison, become a punchline and a cautionary tale. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. "Set up a meeting," Marcus said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Tell him I want to buy it back, no questions asked. Name his price." Vincent arranged the meeting for the following Monday at a warehouse in an industrial area east of Tampa, near the port. The area was mostly deserted at night, populated by shipping containers and abandoned buildings that nobody paid attention to. It was the kind of place where bad things happened, and nobody asked questions afterward. Marcus drove himself, telling no one where he was going. He brought $50,000 in cash, withdrawn from one of his private accounts over the course of several days to avoid triggering any alerts, and a 9mm pistol he'd purchased years ago for protection. He'd never actually fired the gun, had barely even looked at it since buying it. It had sat in a safe in his home office, more of a security blanket than anything else. But as Marcus drove through the darkening streets toward the warehouse, the gun's weight in his jacket pocket felt significant, purposeful. He told himself he was just being cautious, that he wouldn't need it, that this would be a simple transaction. But deep down, in a place Marcus had spent years avoiding looking at too closely, he knew he was lying to himself. Again. Thomas Ridley was younger than Marcus expected, maybe 40, with the weathered look of someone who'd lived hard and fast. He had a scar running through his left eyebrow, faded tattoos creeping up his neck, and the kind of knowing smirk that suggested he was always in on a joke nobody else understood. He wasn't alone. 2 other men stood nearby, clearly there as muscle. They were both bigger than Ridley, both wearing the kind of deliberately neutral expressions that suggested extensive experience with violence. They didn't introduce themselves, just stood with their arms crossed, watching Marcus with the assessment of predators. They met in the center of the empty warehouse, their voices echoing off concrete and steel. The space smelled of motor oil and rust, and Marcus could see his breath in the cool night air. A single flickering light illuminated the scene, casting strange shadows that made everyone look vaguely sinister. "Pastor Webb," Ridley said with a smirk, making Marcus's title sound like an insult. "Never thought I'd be doing business with a man of God, especially not one as famous as you. I've seen your show. Very inspiring. All that talk about honesty and living in God's truth." Marcus ignored the mockery, keeping his expression neutral. "I want the cross back. I'm prepared to pay fairly for its return." Ridley laughed, a harsh sound that bounced off the warehouse walls. The 2 bodyguards didn't react, just continued their silent watching. "See, that's the thing, Pastor. I know what this is really worth now. Not the cross itself. I had it appraised and it's just wood and cheap metal, probably made in some factory in Asia about 30 years ago. Worth maybe a couple $100 retail. But the story? The proof that the great Marcus Webb built his empire on a lie? That's worth a hell of a lot more than 50 grand. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. "What proof are you talking about?" "Oh, come on," Ridley said, still smiling. "You think I don't do my research? I found the estate sale catalogue from Orlando, August 2010. Item number 247, decorative cross, condition good, starting bid $50. I've got photos of the catalogue, photos of the receipt showing it sold to a Marcus Webb for $300. I've even got testimony from the auctioneer who remembers you, because you tried to haggle down the price on a fake religious artifact. Kind of ironic, right?" Marcus's hands clenched into fists. "Those documents don't prove anything." "Maybe not by themselves," Ridley admitted, "but combined with the cross itself, with the metallurgy reports showing it was made in the 1980s, with testimony from the factory in Taiwan that produced them. That's a pretty compelling package for any journalist or prosecutor interested in fraud. And trust me, I found several who are very interested." The rage that Marcus had kept carefully controlled for so many years began to crack its containment. He could feel it rising in his chest, hot and poisonous, threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained facade. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." "I think I do," Ridley said confidently, gesturing to his bodyguards. "I've got protection. I've got insurance. I've already sent copies of everything to 3 different news outlets, sealed envelopes to be opened if something happens to me. So here's how this works. You're going to pay me $500,000, and maybe I convince them not to run the story. Maybe I even give you back the cross and the documentation, or maybe I don't, and you get exposed as a fraud on national television." Something inside Marcus snapped. All the years of pressure of maintaining the facade, of pretending to be something he wasn't, it all came crashing down in that moment. The careful controls he'd spent decades building disintegrated, and what emerged was something raw and primal and dangerous. He pulled the gun from his jacket and fired before he consciously made the decision to do so. The shot echoed through the warehouse like a cannon blast. The bullet caught Ridley in the chest, and he went down hard, his expression transforming from smug confidence to shocked disbelief in an instant. Blood bloomed across his shirt, spreading rapidly. The 2 bodyguards reached for their weapons, moving with practiced speed, But Marcus was faster, driven by panic and fury and years of repressed rage. 2 more shots and both men were on the ground. One took the bullet in the throat and went down gurgling and choking. The other caught it in the stomach and collapsed, curling around his wound. Marcus stood there, breathing hard, the gun still in his hand, and looked at what he'd done. 3 men, 3 bodies, 3 lives ended in the space of maybe 5 seconds. The warehouse was silent except for the wet, labored breathing of the man Marcus had shot in the stomach. That sound seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet, each gasping breath an accusation. Marcus walked over to the dying man and looked down at him. Their eyes met, and Marcus saw fear and pain and pleading. He raised the gun and fired again, silencing the awful breathing. Then there was only silence. For a long moment. Marcus couldn't move. He stood among the bodies, the gun hanging from his hand, and tried to process what he'd just done. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, done something that couldn't be undone. He'd killed 3 men to protect a lie about a worthless piece of metal and wood. But as the initial shock wore off, something else settled over him, a cold, calculating clarity that was somehow worse than the panic. If he was going to survive this, he had to eliminate every loose end, every person who knew about the cross's origins, every person who could connect him to these bodies, every potential threat. Marcus had always been good at compartmentalizing, at separating his public persona from his private thoughts and actions. Now, standing in a warehouse with 3 corpses, he took that ability to a new level. He methodically searched the bodies, finding Ridley's phone in his jacket pocket. Marcus scrolled through the messages, his mind working through the implications of each conversation. Ridley had been thorough, Marcus had to give him that. He'd contacted Vincent Caruso directly, offering to sell information about Marcus. There were texts to a journalist named Rachel Morrison at the Tampa Bay Times, tantalizing her with hints about a major story involving religious fraud. Notes about meetings with 2 other fences who'd helped authenticate the cross and evaluate its real versus purported value. Names, addresses, connections, all of it documented right there in Ridley's phone. Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days, though not in the way a normal person might be haunted by guilt or remorse. He couldn't go back. The only way forward was to eliminate everyone who knew the truth. It was pure survival instinct now, the same instinct that had driven him to build his empire of lies in the first place. He'd spent his whole life doing whatever was necessary to get ahead, to protect his interests, to maintain his image. This was just the next step, just another compromise in a life built on compromises. Marcus used a tarp he found in the warehouse to wrap the bodies, working methodically despite his lack of experience with this kind of thing. He'd seen enough crime shows to know the basics, avoid leaving evidence, minimize DNA transfer, create confusion about timeline and location. His Bentley was too conspicuous, too traceable, but Ridley's truck was perfect. Marcus loaded the bodies into it, drove to a construction site near the port that he knew was currently dormant due to permit issues, and dumped them in a partially dug foundation that would be filled with concrete in a few weeks once the legal problems were resolved. It took him until dawn to finish, and by the time he drove back to the church in his own car, having abandoned Ridley's truck in a neighborhood known for car theft, he'd developed a plan, not just for covering up the murders, but for systematically eliminating everyone who threatened his empire. Over the next 10 days, Florida became the hunting ground for a man who'd lost everything by trying to protect a lie. Marcus used the resources of his church, the private vehicles registered to the ministry, the connections throughout the city, the trust people placed in him as a religious leader, to track down each person on Ridley's list. Vincent Caruso was next. The private investigator had gotten too close, knew too much, and Marcus couldn't risk him putting the pieces together. Marcus invited Vincent to the church for a final payment, told him he'd found the cross, and wanted to thank him for his work. Vincent arrived on a Wednesday evening after most of the staff had gone home. Marcus led him down to the basement maintenance area, supposedly to show him something relevant to the security upgrades they'd been discussing. Marcus shot him twice in the back of the head. The private investigator never saw it coming, never had a chance to react. He died instantly, his body crumpling against the water heater. Marcus had gotten better at killing, more efficient, more detached, The first three had been messy, emotional, driven by panic. This one was calculated, clinical, almost easy. Marcus wrapped Vincent's body in plastic sheeting he'd purchased from a hardware store in Lakeland, using cash and wearing a baseball cap to avoid identification. He disposed of the body in the same construction site that held Ridley and his bodyguards, adding another corpse to the foundation that would soon be filled with concrete and built upon. The symbolism wasn't lost on Marcus. His entire life was built on foundations of lies and death. Rachel Morrison, the journalist, died in what looked like a home invasion. Marcus had spent 2 days studying her routine, learning her patterns, identifying vulnerabilities. She lived alone in a small apartment in St. Petersburg, worked late most nights, usually came home around 10 p.m. Marcus broke into her apartment on a Thursday night, wearing gloves and a mask, and waited for her in the dark. When Rachel came through the door, tired from a long day of chasing stories, Marcus shot her once in the chest. She went down hard, clutching at the wound, her laptop and purse scattering across the floor. Marcus stood over her as she died, watching the life fade from her eyes, and felt nothing. He searched the apartment thoroughly, methodically, looking for any copies of the documents Ridley had sent. He found them on her laptop, on backup drives, in printed form in a folder labeled Web Investigation. Marcus took it all along with her phone and anything else that might contain evidence. He staged the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong, broke a window from the inside, scattered her belongings, took cash and jewelry to make it look convincing. The police would rule it a home invasion, just another tragedy in a city with too many of them. The two fences who'd helped authenticate the cross met similar fates over the next few days. Dennis Park was killed in his antique shop in Sarasota on a Sunday afternoon when he was alone doing inventory. Marcus shot him in the back of the head as he bent over a display case, then set a small fire in the store's office to destroy records and create confusion about motive. The police would eventually conclude it was a robbery gone wrong, that Park had been killed by someone he'd confronted trying to steal merchandise. Luis Hernandez disappeared from a boat dock in Fort Myers on a Tuesday morning. He'd been preparing his fishing boat for a charter later that day when Marcus approached him, pretending to be interested in booking a fishing trip. They talked for a few minutes, Marcus asking questions about rates and schedules, and then he pulled the gun. Hernandez tried to run, but Marcus shot him 3 times. The body went into the Gulf of Mexico, weighted down with chains Marcus had purchased from a marine supply store. Hernandez would likely never be found, and even if he was, the ocean would destroy most of the forensic evidence. Marcus was getting good at this, too good. Each killing became easier, more routine, less emotionally significant. He'd crossed a threshold, become something he'd never imagined he could be, but he told himself it was necessary, that he had no choice, that this was just survival. He'd spent his whole life lying to other people. Now he was lying to himself with the same skill. But Marcus's paranoia grew with each killing. He started seeing threats everywhere. Anyone who'd ever questioned him about the cross, anyone who'd shown too much interest in the church's finances, anyone who might know something, became a potential target. His worldview narrowed to a simple equation: threats versus safety, exposure versus protection. Nothing else mattered. Sarah Chen began asking questions about the missing security footage from the night the cross was stolen. She'd been reviewing backup systems for an audit the board had requested, and she noticed irregularities in the timestamps, gaps that shouldn't exist. Sarah was smart, detail-oriented, the kind of person who noticed when things didn't add up. She came to Marcus's office on a Thursday afternoon with printouts showing the discrepancies. "Pastor Webb," she said carefully, spreading the papers across his desk, "I found something strange in the security logs. There are several hours missing from the night of the theft, and the backup logs show someone accessed the system manually and deleted footage. I thought you should know because—" Marcus realized she'd become too observant, too much of a liability. Sarah knew his schedule better than anyone, knew his patterns and habits, knew when he was lying or hiding something because she'd worked with him for 5 years. If she kept digging, she'd eventually find something that connected him to the murders. He couldn't allow that. "Thank you, Sarah," Marcus said smoothly, his mind already working through the logistics. "This is exactly why I value you so highly. Can you stay late tonight?" I'd like to go over the audit preparations, make sure we're ready for the board meeting. Sarah agreed, as Marcus knew she would. She was dedicated, loyal, always willing to go the extra mile. That evening, after everyone else had left, Marcus walked Sarah to her car in the parking lot. He told her he'd forgotten to give her some documents she'd need for the morning, asked her to wait by her car while he ran back inside to get them. Then he returned with the gun. Marcus shot her 3 times, quick succession, center mass like he'd seen in movies. Sarah died quickly, slumping against her car. Marcus staged it to look like a carjacking, took her purse, her laptop, scattered the contents, left the car door open. The police would assume she'd been targeted by someone after her valuables, that she'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He felt a brief pang of something when he looked at her body, not quite guilt, but a recognition of waste. Sarah had been competent, efficient, one of the few people who'd actually made his life easier rather than more complicated. But she'd become a threat, and threats had to be eliminated. That was the logic he lived by now. Dwight Morrison was harder. The former cop had started conducting his own investigation, suspicious of how the cross had disappeared and deeply troubled by Sarah's death. He'd known Sarah personally, had recruited her for the job when she'd first interviewed, considered her a friend. Her murder didn't sit right with him. The carjacking story didn't add up. Her car was still there. Nothing particularly valuable had been taken except her work laptop and phone, and the location didn't fit the pattern of other robberies in the area. Dwight started asking questions, reviewing footage again, talking to other security staff. He noticed that Pastor Webb had been acting strangely for weeks, had lost weight, seemed constantly stressed and paranoid. Dwight's cop instincts were screaming that something was wrong, and he couldn't ignore them even though every rational part of his brain told him to let it go, to stop seeing conspiracies where there probably weren't any. Marcus realized Dwight was getting too close. The former cop came to his office on a Monday morning with questions about Marcus's whereabouts on certain dates, discrepancies he'd noticed in the security logs, connections he was starting to make. Marcus knew he was running out of time. "Dwight," Marcus said warmly, "I appreciate your diligence, but I think you might be seeing patterns where there aren't any. Sarah's death was a tragedy, but it was random violence. The police have already concluded their investigation. With all due respect, Pastor Webb, the police investigation was cursory at best, and there are too many coincidences. Sarah's murder, Vincent Caruso disappearing, the security footage gaps. Something's wrong here, and as head of security, it's my responsibility to figure out what." Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I understand your concern. Tell you what, why don't we drive out to the youth retreat property this afternoon? We can discuss the security upgrades I want to implement there, get some fresh air, clear our heads. Sometimes we see things more clearly when we step away from the immediate situation." Dwight agreed, though Marcus could see the suspicion in his eyes. The former cop was smart, experienced, probably suspected that something was off. But he also believed in chain of command, in giving people the benefit of the doubt, in following procedures. Those beliefs would kill him. They drove separately to the retreat property, 30 miles outside Tampa, in a rural area surrounded by pine forests. The property had dormitories for youth groups, a small chapel, hiking trails, and a lot of isolated wilderness. Marcus led Dwight on a walk through the woods, supposedly to show him where he wanted new security cameras installed. They were a mile from the nearest building when Marcus pulled the gun. Dwight's hand immediately went to his hip, but he wasn't armed. Church property policy prohibited weapons on staff. He'd spent 25 years as a cop, had faced down armed suspects dozens of times, but retirement had made him soft, trusting. He'd never thought he'd need to protect himself from a pastor. "Marcus, what are you doing?" Dwight said carefully, his training kicking in, trying to de-escalate. "I'm sorry, Dwight, you were getting too close. You're too good at your job, too good at seeing patterns." Marcus kept the gun steady, his hand no longer trembling like it had the first time. He'd killed 8 people now, Ridley and his 2 bodyguards, Vincent, Rachel, the 2 fences, and Sarah. 8 people in less than 2 weeks. What was one more? "Whatever you're involved in, we can fix it," Dwight said, his voice calm despite the gun pointed at him. "I know you're not a bad man. Something happened. Something got out of control. We can work through this. No, Marcus said simply. We can't. There's no working through this, no fixing it. The only way forward is to eliminate anyone who might figure out what really happened. He pulled the trigger 3 times. Dwight took all 3 bullets but stayed on his feet longer than Marcus expected, his cop training and physical conditioning keeping him conscious even as blood poured from his wounds. He looked at Marcus with something like pity mixed with the pain, as if he'd seen something Marcus couldn't see himself, the complete corruption of a soul that had probably never been particularly good to begin with. Then Dwight collapsed, and Marcus stood over him until he stopped breathing. Marcus buried Dwight's body in the woods behind the dormitory building, digging the grave himself with a shovel from the maintenance shed. It took hours, and by the time he finished, his hands were blistered and his back ached. But he felt nothing about the act itself. No remorse, no horror, just the grim satisfaction of a problem solved. Dwight's disappearance would be chalked up to a middle-aged man having a crisis and running away from his life. It happened all the time. His wife would file a missing persons report, the police would investigate half-heartedly, and eventually the case would go cold. No one would connect it to Marcus or the church. 3 more people died over the following week. And by this point, Marcus had developed a system. He identified threats, planned methodically, executed efficiently, and covered his tracks carefully. The 3 additional victims were people who'd been unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, to know something they shouldn't, to represent even a minimal risk to Marcus's continued freedom. The sound technician named Bobby Alvarez died in what looked like a car accident on I-275. Bobby had overheard Marcus arguing with Vincent on the phone 2 weeks earlier, had mentioned to a co-worker that Pastor Webb had seemed really agitated about something. Marcus had rigged Bobby's brakes to fail, causing him to crash at high speed during his commute home. The accident investigation concluded it was mechanical failure, probably due to poor maintenance. A bookkeeper named Patricia Simmons was killed in her home, another staged home invasion. Patricia had noticed large cash withdrawals from the church accounts and had started asking questions about them. She'd sent an email to the board requesting clarification about certain expenses, and that email had sealed her fate. Marcus made it look like a burglary, took her computer and files, destroyed any evidence of her financial investigation. A board member named Gerald Hutchinson, who'd asked too many questions about Marcus's increasingly erratic behavior and Sarah's death, died from an apparent heart attack in his car. Marcus had put a massive dose of potassium chloride in Gerald's coffee during a board meeting, causing cardiac arrest that looked natural for a man in his 60s with a history of high blood pressure. The autopsy ruled it natural causes, and Gerald was buried 3 days later with Marcus delivering a moving eulogy about God calling his faithful servants home. By the time Marcus killed his 11th victim, a locksmith named Tony Martinez, who'd rekeyed his office door and might have noticed scratches on the original lock, he'd become a different person entirely. The charismatic preacher was gone, replaced by something cold and methodical, a predator wearing a pastor's face. Tony had been unlucky, had mentioned to someone that Pastor Webb had seemed nervous when he'd done the lockwork, had said something was wrong with the original lock, like it had been picked. That conversation had been reported back to Marcus by one of his staff members, who thought he'd want to know about potential security issues. Marcus killed Tony in the locksmith's shop after hours, shot him once in the head, and staged it to look like a robbery. He took cash from the register, scattered tools and equipment, broke a window. Another random crime in a city full of them. But Marcus had made mistakes. In his paranoia and haste, he'd left traces. The pattern was there for anyone who knew where to look, connections waiting to be made, and Detective Angela Rodriguez of the Tampa Police Department was the one who found it. Angela was 38 years old, 15 years on the force, with a reputation for being thorough and relentless. She'd been investigating Sarah Chen's death when she noticed something odd. Several recent missing persons cases and unsolved homicides all had one thing in common. They were connected, however tangentially, to Redemption Grace Megachurch. At first she'd dismissed it as coincidence. The church was huge, had thousands of members, employed hundreds of people. Of course, some of them would encounter crime. But the more she dug, the more the coincidences piled up. Vincent Caruso, the PI, had been working for the church before he disappeared. Rachel Morrison had been investigating the church before her murder. Sarah Chen and Dwight Morrison both worked there. The other victims all had connections, some thin, some substantial, but all there if you looked carefully enough. Angela started pulling threads quietly at first. She reviewed security footage from areas near crime scenes, interviewed witnesses again with new questions, built a timeline. She found a traffic camera that caught Marcus's Bentley near Rachel Morrison's apartment the night she died. Cell tower data placed Marcus's phone at multiple crime scenes around the times of death. The pattern was there, clear as day, once you knew to look for it. When Angela realized what she was looking at, the scope of it took her breath away. This wasn't gang violence or random crime. This was systematic elimination of witnesses by someone with resources and reach, someone who moved through Tampa's streets with impunity because nobody suspected him. A serial killer hiding behind a clerical collar. She brought her findings to her lieutenant, spread the evidence across his desk, and watched his expression change from skeptical to horrified. "You're telling me Pastor Marcus Webb, the televangelist, is a serial killer?" "I'm telling you the evidence points to someone at that church being involved in at least 11 murders, and Webb is the common denominator in all of them. He had access, opportunity, and motive, though I'm still working on exactly what that motive is." The lieutenant stared at the timeline, the connections, the evidence. "This is going to be huge. If you're wrong—" "I'm not wrong," Angela said firmly. "I've got enough for a warrant. Maybe not enough for conviction yet, but enough to bring him in for questioning." The warrant for Marcus Webb's arrest was issued on a Wednesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Thomas Ridley's murder. Our tactical team was assembled because nobody knew how Marcus would react when cornered. He'd killed at least 11 people. He might not go quietly. But by the time police arrived at the church, Marcus was already in the wind. He'd seen it coming, recognized the way Angela had been circling closer. He'd noticed her interviewing people, reviewing footage, asking questions. She'd been subtle, but Marcus had spent years reading people, recognizing threats, and he'd known his time was running out. He'd packed a bag with cash, fake IDs he'd purchased years ago as insurance, and the gun that had started it all. The manhunt that followed captivated the nation. News helicopters circled Tampa, broadcasting footage of police searching the megachurch. Reporters interviewed shocked congregation members who couldn't believe their beloved pastor was a suspected serial killer. The story had everything: religion, murder, hypocrisy, betrayal. Networks ran non-stop coverage. True crime podcasts devoted emergency episodes to the case. Social media exploded with theories and speculation. How could a prominent televangelist, a man who preached love and redemption every Sunday, become a serial killer? The question obsessed millions of Americans who watched the story unfold. Psychologists appeared on television to discuss narcissistic personality disorder, religious fraud, and the psychology of serial killers. Journalists investigated Marcus's background, uncovering a history of lies, financial irregularities, and ethical violations that had been hidden beneath his charismatic exterior. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. A homeless veteran named Carl Jenkins, who often slept in the wooded area behind the youth retreat property, came forward with information. Carl was in his 60s, had been living rough for 15 years since coming back from Iraq, and usually avoided police because of outstanding warrants for minor offenses. But the news coverage of the manhunt had shown photos of Dwight Morrison, and Carl recognized him. "I seen that man," Carl told police at a station in Hillsborough County. "Couple weeks ago, I was sleeping in the woods near that church camp, woke up to voices, saw 2 men walking into the trees. One was that Morrison guy. The other was dressed nice, looked like somebody important. I heard gunshots, then just the one guy came back out alone. He was digging for hours. I was too scared to come out, didn't want no trouble." Carl led police to the general area where he'd seen the digging. It took 2 days of searching with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, but they found Dwight Morrison's body buried in a shallow grave. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Ballistic tests matched the bullets to the same gun used in several other murders. Marcus's DNA was on Dwight's clothing. The timeline matched perfectly. With that discovery, police obtained warrants to search other locations. They dug up the construction site and found Ridley and his bodyguards. They linked Marcus to the other murders through phone records, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence. The case was airtight. They just had to find him. Marcus was finally cornered at a cheap motel in Panama City, near the Alabama border, trying to arrange passage to Mexico through a smuggler contact. He'd been on the run for 6 days, sleeping in his car, using cash for everything, avoiding cameras. But he'd gotten sloppy, desperate, and someone at the motel had recognized him from television. When police knocked on his door at 3 in the morning, Marcus didn't run or fight. He simply opened it and put his hands up, the fight gone out of him. The man they arrested looked nothing like the confident preacher who'd commanded attention from thousands. His hair was greasy and unkempt, his face gaunt from days without proper food, his eyes hollow and haunted by the faces of the people he'd killed. They handcuffed him gently, read him his rights, and walked him out to a waiting police car. Cameras caught every moment. Marcus in handcuffs, looking small and defeated, nothing like the larger-than-life figure who'd filled television screens for years. The image would become iconic, appearing in documentaries and true crime books for decades to come. The trial lasted 6 weeks and dominated headlines across the country. Court TV broadcast every moment. Legal analysts dissected each day's testimony. Prosecutors painted a picture of a narcissist so consumed with protecting his image that he'd murdered anyone who threatened to expose him. They called witnesses who testified about Marcus's controlling behavior, his paranoia, his increasingly erratic actions in the weeks before the murders. The evidence was overwhelming. Phone records placed Marcus's phone at murder scenes. Surveillance footage showed his car. Forensic evidence linked him to multiple victims. His financial records showed large cash withdrawals coinciding with the murders, expenditures that made sense only if he'd been paying for supplies and traveling to crime scenes. DNA evidence connected him to several victims. The murder weapon was found in his car when he was arrested, with ballistics matching it to 8 of the 11 murders. The defense tried to argue diminished capacity, that the stress of maintaining his public persona had driven Marcus to a mental breakdown. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about the psychological toll of living a double life, the cognitive dissonance of preaching morality while engaging in fraud, the way prolonged stress could warp someone's perception of reality and appropriate responses to threats. But the prosecution countered with evidence of premeditation, planning, and calculated execution. These weren't crimes of passion or mental illness. They were systematic eliminations carried out with cold efficiency. Marcus had stalked his victims, studied their routines, planned each murder carefully. He'd covered his tracks, staged crime scenes, created false narratives. This was the behavior of someone in full control of his faculties, someone who'd made conscious choices about who lived and who died. The jury heard testimony from forensic experts who reconstructed the murders in excruciating detail. They heard from family members of the victims who described the people Marcus had killed, their hopes, their dreams, their plans for futures that had been stolen from them. Sarah Chen's mother broke down on the stand, describing her daughter's dedication to her work, how she'd believed so completely in the mission of redemption grace. Dwight Morrison's wife testified about finding his empty chair at the dinner table, about waiting for him to come home, about the growing certainty that something terrible had happened. Rachel Morrison's editor at the Tampa Bay Times testified about the story she'd been investigating, how excited she'd been about exposing religious fraud, how she'd talked about it being career-defining work. Thomas Ridley's sister Emily spoke about her brother's flaws and mistakes, but also about his fundamental humanity, about how he'd been trying to turn his life around, about the nephew who'd never meet his uncle because of Marcus's actions. The prosecution's closing argument was delivered by Assistant State Attorney Jennifer Walsh, a veteran prosecutor known for her methodical approach and powerful courtroom presence. She stood before the jury, making eye contact with each member, and spoke for nearly 2 hours. Marcus Webb spent his entire adult life pretending to be something he wasn't, Jennifer began. He pretended to be a man of God while committing fraud. He pretended to care about his congregation while stealing from them. He pretended to be moral while living in luxury, funded by their donations. But when his lies were threatened, When Thomas Ridley discovered the truth about the cross that formed the foundation of Webb's empire, the pretending stopped. What emerged was the real Marcus Webb, a man capable of cold-blooded murder to protect his image and his wealth. She walked the jury through each murder, showing how Marcus had planned and executed them, how he'd eliminated anyone who threatened to expose him. This wasn't self-defense, this wasn't a crime of passion, this was systematic, calculated murder. Marcus Webb made a choice. His secrets were worth more than human life. Thomas Ridley's life, Vincent Caruso's life, Rachel Morrison's life, Sarah Chen's life, Dwight Morrison's life, all of them worth less to Marcus Webb than protecting a lie about a worthless cross. Jennifer paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the courtroom. The defense wants you to believe that Marcus Webb was somehow not responsible for his actions, that stress drove him to this. But the evidence shows a man in complete control, making rational decisions about who to kill and how to kill them. He researched their routines, he planned his approaches, he staged crime scenes to mislead investigators. This is not the behavior of someone having a mental breakdown. This is the behavior of a predator hunting prey. She returned to the prosecutor's table and picked up an evidence bag containing the gun Marcus had used. This weapon ended 11 lives, 11 people who had families, friends, hopes, dreams, 11 people who deserved to live. Marcus Webb took that from them, not in a moment of madness, but through 11 separate conscious decisions to kill. The defense's closing argument, delivered by Marcus's lead attorney Michael Chen, tried to paint a picture of a man broken by impossible pressures. My client is not the monster the prosecution describes. He's a flawed human being who made terrible mistakes under unbearable stress. For years, he lived with the knowledge that his entire life was built on a lie. He spent every day afraid of exposure, terrified of losing everything. That kind of sustained psychological pressure can break anyone. Michael gestured toward Marcus, who sat at the defense table looking small and defeated. When Thomas Ridley threatened to expose him, something inside Marcus Webb snapped. He panicked. He made the worst decision of his life. And then, caught in the aftermath of that decision, he panicked again and again. Each subsequent murder was an attempt to escape consequences of the previous one. This is not the behavior of a calculating serial killer. This is the behavior of someone spiraling out of control. But the argument rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before reaching their verdict. When they filed back into the courtroom, none of them looked at Marcus, a sign that defense attorneys recognized immediately. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Patricia Holloway asked. The foreman, a retired teacher named Robert Martinez, stood. "We have, Your Honor." "What say you?" "On count 1, murder in the first degree of Thomas Ridley, we find the defendant guilty. On count 2, murder in the first degree of David Foster, we find the defendant guilty. On count 3, murder in the first degree of James Wilson, we find the defendant guilty." The litany continued through all 11 counts. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Marcus showed no reaction, just stared at the table in front of him. His attorneys slumped in their chairs, knowing they'd lost completely. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later. Family members of the victims were given the opportunity to address the court and speak directly to Marcus about the impact of his crimes. The testimony took 2 full days and was emotionally devastating. Emily Ridley spoke first, her voice shaking but determined. "My brother Thomas wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, lived on the wrong side of the law sometimes, but he was my brother. He was funny and loyal, and he loved his nephew more than anything. He was trying to get his life together, had just enrolled in community college to study business. You took all of that away because you couldn't face the truth about yourself. You stole his future. Stole his chance to become the man he was trying to be. I hope you think about him every day for the rest of your life." Dwight Morrison's wife Linda spoke next, tears streaming down her face. Dwight served his community for 25 years as a police officer. He risked his life every day to protect people. He believed in justice, in doing the right thing no matter the cost. He trusted you. He worked for you. And you killed him because he was too good at his job, because he was getting close to the truth. You betrayed his trust and his dedication. You took away the man I loved, my children's father, the best person I've ever known. Sarah Chen's mother May spoke in accented English, her hands trembling as she gripped the podium. "My daughter believed in you. She thought you were a good man doing God's work. She defended you when people questioned the church's finances. She worked long hours because she believed she was serving a higher purpose. And you murdered her in a parking lot like she was nothing. She was my only child. She was going to give me grandchildren. You took everything from our family." The testimony continued for hours. Bobby Alvarez's widow describing her struggle to raise 3 children alone. Patricia Simmons' daughter talking about growing up without her mother. Gerald Hutchinson's son explaining how his father's supposed heart attack had devastated their family before they learned the truth. Each story added another layer of pain, another illustration of the destruction Marcus had caused. Rachel Morrison's editor spoke about the loss to journalism, the stories that would never be written, the truth that Rachel had been chasing that died with her. Vincent Caruso's ex-wife testified about their children growing up believing their father had abandoned them, only to learn years later that he'd been murdered. Tony Martinez's sister described a gentle man who'd worked with his hands all his life, who'd never hurt anyone, killed for the crime of noticing something he shouldn't have. Through it all, Marcus sat silent, his expression unreadable. It was impossible to tell if he felt remorse or was simply numb to it all. Finally, Judge Holloway asked if Marcus wished to address the court. His attorneys advised against it, but Marcus stood anyway, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked smaller than he had during his televangelist days, diminished by months in jail and the weight of what he'd done. "I told myself I was protecting something sacred," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. The courtroom fell silent, straining to hear. The ministry, the church, the faith of thousands of people. But I was only protecting myself and my lies. Every person I killed, I told myself it was necessary, that I had no choice. But there's always a choice. I made mine, and I'll spend the rest of my life paying for it." He paused, looking directly at the families of his victims who sat in the front rows. Some met his gaze, others looked away. "No words can bring them back or make this right. All I can say is that I'm sorry, and I know that means nothing. I became the thing I always preached against, a man who loved his treasures more than human life. I built my entire existence on lies, and when those lies were threatened, I chose to kill rather than face the truth about myself." Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "I spent years telling people how to live, how to find redemption, how to be better, but I never applied any of it to myself. I was a fraud from the beginning, and instead of admitting it, instead of asking for forgiveness and trying to make amends, I murdered 11 innocent people. That's my legacy. Not the church I built, not the sermons I preached, but 11 lives stolen because I was too cowardly to face consequences." He sat back down, and Judge Holloway spent a moment reviewing her notes before speaking. Her voice was firm, carrying the weight of judicial authority. "Mr. Webb, in my 30 years on the bench, I have never encountered a case quite like this. You held a position of trust, of moral authority. People came to you seeking guidance, seeking hope, seeking connection with the divine, and you exploited that trust at every turn. You stole from them financially, but far worse, you stole their faith, their belief that there were still good people in the world trying to do good things." Judge Holloway leaned forward slightly. "When your fraud was discovered, when Mr. Ridley threatened to expose you, you didn't choose honesty. You didn't choose to face the consequences of your actions. Instead, you embarked on a killing spree that terrorized this community and destroyed 11 families. You didn't kill in the heat of passion. You didn't kill in self-defense. You killed methodically, carefully, repeatedly, because you valued your reputation and your wealth more than human life." She paused, making eye contact with Marcus. "The law provides for certain sentences in cases of multiple first-degree murders. Given the premeditated nature of these crimes, the vulnerability of some victims, and your complete lack of remorse until you were caught, I am sentencing you to 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. You will spend the rest of your natural life in prison, and you will never walk free again." The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot. Marcus Webb was 53 years old. In the aftermath, Redemption Grace Megachurch crumbled rapidly. The board of directors resigned en masse within days of the verdict. The congregation, which had already been hemorrhaging members since Marcus's arrest, effectively dissolved. The building was sold to a real estate developer who paid pennies on the dollar, with proceeds going to a victim compensation fund. The television program The Path to Redemption was cancelled, its syndication deals terminated, its archives removed from streaming platforms. Investigations into the church's finances revealed years of fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of donations. Marcus had stolen millions from people who trusted him, people who believed their money was going to missionary work, charitable causes, and spreading the gospel. Instead, it had funded his mansion, his cars, his lavish lifestyle. Additional charges were filed, though they were largely symbolic given that Marcus was already serving 11 life sentences. The IRS seized Marcus's assets, the beachfront mansion in Clearwater, the vacation home in the Smoky Mountains, the luxury vehicles, the offshore accounts. Everything was liquidated and added to the victim compensation fund. In the end, Marcus was left with nothing except a prison cell and the weight of what he'd done. Detective Angela Rodriguez stood outside the courthouse after the sentencing, speaking to reporters about the case that had consumed her life for months. Cameras surrounded her, microphones thrust forward, reporters shouting questions. She waited for the noise to die down before speaking. "This wasn't about religion or faith," Angela said, her voice steady and professional. "This was about a man who built his life on lies and was willing to kill to protect them. Marcus Webb could have chosen honesty at any point. When Thomas Ridley confronted him, he could have admitted the fraud, faced the consequences, and tried to make amends. Instead, he chose murder. And then he chose it again and again and again." A reporter shouted a question about whether there might be more victims. Angela shook her head. "We've conducted an exhaustive investigation. We're confident we've identified all of Marcus Webb's victims. But I want to be clear. If anyone has information about suspicious deaths or disappearances connected to Webb or Redemption Grace Church, we want to hear from you. This case is closed, but we remain vigilant." Another reporter asked about the impact on Tampa's religious community. Angela paused, choosing her words carefully. "Marcus Webb doesn't represent the faith community. He was a predator who used religion as camouflage. The vast majority of religious leaders in this city are good people trying to help their communities. Don't let one monster destroy your faith in humanity. But do remember this: trust has to be earned through actions, not words. Question authority. Demand transparency. And if something feels wrong, speak up." The families of the victims struggled to make sense of the senseless. Support groups formed, bringing together people bound by tragedy. They met weekly at a community center in Tampa, sharing their grief, their anger, their struggle to move forward. A memorial service was held 6 months after Marcus's conviction at a non-denominational church that volunteered its space, with all 11 families present. Emily Ridley spoke at the memorial, standing before photos of all the victims arranged on a table. Candles flickered around the photos, creating a warm glow in the otherwise somber space. She looked at each family, seeing her own pain reflected in their faces. "My brother wasn't perfect," Emily began, her voice shaking but growing stronger. "None of them were. Thomas had a criminal record. He made mistakes, lived on the wrong side of the law sometimes. But he didn't deserve to die for trying to expose a fraud. None of them did. Sarah Chen was dedicated to her work. Dwight Morrison was trying to do the right thing. Rachel Morrison was chasing the truth. They were all just living their lives, making their choices, trying to get by. And Marcus Webb took that away from them." She looked around at the other families gathered there. Mothers, fathers, siblings, children of the dead. "We all want to believe there's some greater meaning to this, some reason why this happened. But sometimes evil is just evil. Sometimes people make terrible choices and innocent people pay the price. There's no grand plan, no hidden purpose. Just one man's selfishness and cowardice leading to 11 murders." Emily wiped tears from her eyes. "All we can do is remember our loved ones and try to find a way forward. We can't let Marcus Webb's evil define the rest of our lives. We have to choose to keep living, to keep loving, to keep finding joy where we can. That's how we honor them, by refusing to let their deaths be the end of the story. The memorial continued for hours, with each family sharing memories, telling stories, creating a tapestry of lives that had been vibrant and complex and real. Thomas Ridley had been funny, could make anyone laugh with his impressions. Vincent Caruso had loved classic cars and spent weekends restoring a 1967 Mustang. Rachel Morrison had volunteered at an animal shelter, had 3 rescue cats she'd saved from euthanasia. Sarah Chen had been learning to play guitar, had dreams of traveling to Asia to connect with her heritage. Dwight Morrison had coached Little League Baseball, had been teaching his grandson to fish. Bobby Alvarez had been planning to open his own recording studio. Patricia Simmons had been taking painting classes, discovering artistic talent she'd never known she had. Gerald Hutchinson had just become a grandfather, had been over the moon about the new baby. The 2 fences, Luis Hernandez and Dennis Park, had families, friends, lives beyond their criminal activities. Tony Martinez had been saving money to take his mother to Spain, the country she'd left as a young woman and always wanted to see again. David Foster and James Wilson, Ridley's bodyguards, had been former Marines trying to make a living in the private security sector. They'd served their country, survived Iraq and Afghanistan, come home to build civilian lives. They'd died in a warehouse because they'd been hired to protect a small-time fence who'd made the mistake of threatening the wrong person. Each story added depth, humanity, reality to people who'd been reduced to victims in news reports. They'd been more than just casualties of Marcus Webb's crimes. They'd been people with dreams and flaws and futures that would never be realized. In his cell at Union Correctional Institution, Marcus Webb spent his days in isolation, partly for his own protection and partly because he requested it. Prison was brutal for anyone, but particularly for a former televangelist who'd become infamous. Other inmates wanted to hurt him, to punish him for betraying everything he claimed to represent, to make a name for themselves by taking down someone famous. Marcus had been attacked twice in the first month, once in the shower, once in the dining hall. Both times guards had intervened before serious damage was done, but the message was clear. He wasn't safe in general population. So he spent 23 hours a day in a cell barely larger than a closet, allowed out for 1 hour of recreation in a cage-like enclosure that barely qualified as being outdoors. He no longer prayed, no longer opened the Bible that sat on his shelf gathering dust. He'd spent so many years speaking words he didn't believe, selling faith he didn't have, that he'd lost the ability to distinguish truth from performance. Now, stripped of his audience and his facade, he was left with only his thoughts and the weight of what he'd done. The thoughts were relentless, inescapable. In the silence of his cell, Marcus thought about each victim, saw their faces, remembered the moment they died. He thought about Sarah Chen often, her efficiency and loyalty, how she'd trusted him completely even as he planned her murder. The way she'd smiled when he'd asked her to stay late that final evening, eager to help, never suspecting that her dedication would get her killed. He thought about Dwight Morrison's last words, the way the former cop had tried to talk him down, had offered him a way out, even with a gun pointed at his face. Dwight had seen something in Marcus, some possibility for redemption, right up until the moment Marcus pulled the trigger. That faith, that fundamental belief in human goodness, had gotten Dwight killed. He thought about Thomas Ridley, whose only crime had been recognizing an opportunity and trying to capitalize on it. Ridley had been a criminal, sure, but he hadn't deserved to die. None of them had deserved to die, and Marcus had killed them all to protect a lie about a worthless cross. Sometimes in the dark hours before dawn, when sleep wouldn't come, Marcus wondered if he'd ever really believed in anything at all. Had there ever been genuine faith beneath the performance? Had he started out with good intentions that got corrupted over time? Or had he always been empty inside, just a talented actor who'd found a lucrative stage? The questions haunted him, but the answers didn't matter anymore. The man who'd once commanded attention from thousands now spent his days in a cell, forgotten by everyone except the families whose lives he'd destroyed, and the guards who kept him alive despite his requests otherwise. Marcus had attempted suicide twice, once by hanging with a bedsheet, once by slashing his wrists with a piece of broken plastic. Both times he'd been found and saved, patched up and put back in his cell. Suicide watch protocols were implemented. Sharp objects were prohibited. His bedding was replaced with tear-resistant material. The prison had a duty to keep him alive, even if Marcus himself had decided life wasn't worth living. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd taken 11 lives, and now the state wouldn't allow him to take his own. The story of Marcus Webb became a case study in criminal psychology programs across the country. Universities used his case to teach students about narcissistic personality disorder, about how external pressures combined with internal character flaws could escalate to murder. Professors analyzed his behavior, his motivations, the progression from fraud to serial killing. Documentaries were made. Netflix produced a 6-part series titled The Pastor's Path to Murder, which became one of their most watched true crime offerings. HBO created a 2-hour special focusing on the investigation and Angela Rodriguez's role in solving the case. CNN ran multiple episodes analyzing different aspects of the crimes. Podcasts devoted hundreds of hours to dissecting every detail, interviewing everyone connected to the case, speculating about Marcus's psychology. Books were written by journalists, psychologists, former congregation members. False Prophet: The Marcus Webb Story, by investigative journalist Michael Brennan, spent 12 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Megachurch Murders: Inside the Mind of Marcus Webb, by forensic psychologist Dr. Patricia Chen, became required reading in criminology courses. Former church members wrote memoirs about their experiences, about how they'd been deceived, about the process of recovery after having their faith betrayed so completely. But for the people of Tampa, for the congregation that had believed so completely in Marcus, the real pain was the betrayal itself. They'd trusted him with their faith, their hopes, their money. They'd brought their children to his services, sought his counsel during difficult times, believed his promises of redemption and grace, and all of it had been a lie. Jennifer Walsh, who'd been a member of Redemption Grace for 10 years before Marcus's arrest, spoke about the aftermath in an interview with the Tampa Bay Times. She'd been one of the church's most dedicated members, had volunteered for every event, had recruited friends and family to join. The revelation of Marcus's crimes had shattered her world. "You question everything after something like this," Jennifer said, sitting in her living room with photos of her time at the church scattered around her. She looked at pictures of herself smiling next to Marcus at various events, and the images made her sick now. "If I could be so wrong about someone I saw every week, someone I trusted with my spiritual life, someone I believed was a genuine man of God, what else am I wrong about? It shakes you to your core. You start doubting your judgment, your ability to read people, your faith itself." She picked up a photo from a church picnic, Marcus in the center, surrounded by smiling congregants. "I look at these pictures now and I see something different than I did then. His smile doesn't reach his eyes. There's something calculating in his expression. But I didn't see it at the time. None of us did. We saw what we wanted to see. A charismatic leader who made us feel good about ourselves and our faith." Jennifer paused, gathering her thoughts. "But I've learned something through all this pain. Faith isn't about following a person, no matter how charismatic or convincing they seem. It's about following principles, about being part of a community that holds each other accountable. Marcus Webb failed us, but he doesn't get to destroy our faith. Some of us have found new churches, more transparent ones with better oversight. Some of us have left organized religion entirely. But we're all finding our own paths forward, and that's okay." The impact rippled through Tampa's religious community in complex ways. Some churches saw increased attendance as people sought spiritual guidance in the aftermath of the scandal. Others saw declining membership as people questioned whether any religious leader could be trusted. Mega churches particularly suffered, with many people associating large, wealthy religious organizations with potential corruption. A coalition of Tampa religious leaders formed in response to the scandal, creating new transparency standards and accountability measures. They published their financial records online, implemented term limits for leadership positions, created independent oversight boards with community members. It was an attempt to rebuild trust, to show that Marcus Webb was an aberration rather than the norm. 3 years after his conviction, Marcus received a letter from Emily Ridley. She'd spent those years in intensive therapy, working through her anger and grief, trying to make sense of her brother's death. Her therapist had suggested writing a letter to Marcus as part of the healing process, even if she never sent it. But Emily had decided to send it, had decided Marcus needed to know the impact of what he'd done. The letter arrived on a Thursday, delivered with Marcus's weekly mail call. He'd received hate mail before, dozens of letters from people calling him evil, promising him eternal damnation, describing in detail what they hoped would happen to him in prison. He usually threw them away unread, but something about Emily's name on the return address made him open this one. The letter was handwritten, 2 pages in neat cursive. Marcus, I've spent 3 years hating you for killing my brother, for destroying my family, for taking away someone I loved. That hatred consumed me, poisoned everything good in my life. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything except what you did. My therapist says I need to forgive you to move forward, but I can't. I don't forgive you. What you did is unforgivable. Tom had his whole life ahead of him. He was finally getting his act together, finally becoming the man I always knew he could.